the weirdest thing about this room I realize is that it's actually got built-in speakers, but they never give you a long enough cable to plug into the actual port in the wall. Yeah. Actually, you guys want to see? It's kind of cool. We will be starting the panel in a second, I just figured. It's going to be pretty depressing, guys. I might as well not miss words. See? And now we have like full surround sound. They just never give you a long enough cable. Good morning, everybody.
Morning.
Hope you're all doing well. Welcome to Otaku Island, a panel dedicated to the the anime fans of Cuba. Just full disclosure, this is actually the first time we're having somebody stream that's just usually, I tend to give a disclaimer. I actually tend to give a disclaimer usually just to say for the sake of the safety of the people in the videos, just because this is kind of, we'll get through the history and everything of Cuba, and the situation, how it led to actually having anime fans. Usually I would say not to post everything, but at this point, after the recent protests over the last 2 months, everyone's being investigated anyways, so. Let's get to it. Hold on. Now I'll switch to the closer mic. But I wanted to show we can do that. Just because. It's like, why are they giving us speakers? We have this whole thing up here. So? Just to start out with a disclaimer, I always try to dedicate this to the people that made it all. You know, they're still there, working and trying their best to make everything work in the island of Cuba. I've got this whole disclaimer about taking photos and videos. In this case, just do it. You might as well. So, let's go through the basics. Let's talk about Cuba as an island and its current status, both diplomatically, politically, and of course geographically, for those that don't know where it is. So, island nation, we're at roughly 90 miles off of our coast. Urban population is, a total of 72% of the 77% of the population, so we're a very strongly urban country. Less than a quarter of people living out in the countryside, or what we would consider even suburbs. It's pretty much all urban core, whether it's Savannah, Holguin, Santiago de Cuba. What's very interesting, I really want to point everybody to that third bullet point. I know that going through bullet points on a PowerPoint are kind of seem boring, but about 1/4 of the country is under the age of 24. It's a very young population, and they're really going to be the big focus of today's panel. Just to show you guys that it's definitely, because I'm sure anime is in our own culture, as you guys can see, is very dedicated to the young. They're no exception. So, government is a communist single-state party system. Anybody that's surprised about that, no worries. Definitely ask questions. So, economy is state-controlled, limited to private ownership. Right now that's slowly starting to change with government approval. I'm not going to tell you it's good or bad. I'll let you guys make the decision on your own. Average Cuban citizens earn an income of roughly about $50. Maybe $50 to $300 a month max. Just take a moment and think about how much that last figurine you bought, whether or not it was you lived the rest of your month. So, the currency is currently in an inflation crisis, meaning it's very hard to get items. What was once, bootleg anime figurines is now, they just wanted to get toiletries. Brief history, just a social studies lesson. Cuban opening started in 1818. Now we'll walk over to the front just to get this done. Open trade with the world 1818, Spanish colonial control, and controls pretty much the whole island, with U.S. limited interests. We've got the Spanish-American War in 1898, which really increased American involvement, putting forward the Monroe Doctrine. Then we've got eventually you've got the 1959 revolution. That's where we get Fidel Castro and the current dictatorship. Relations, of course, are a Cold War flashpoint. We've got the Cuban Missile Crisis, and embargo that we are currently still living with, as far as trade not being normalized. So, Cuba placed it as state-sponsored terrorism in 1982. That is actually returned as of a couple, little over a year ago. From outgoing Trump administration, that was one of their closing things to do, was to add them to the state-sponsored list of terrorism. Very frustrating to travel to. Now let's get to the reason we're all here. Let's start talking about their fans. Because as it turns out, despite an embargo, despite trade regulations, despite horrific, terrible human rights records, anime still gets its way into the country. Whether on a flash drive, stored away in a family member's briefcase, or suitcase on a flight, and just shared throughout private home networks using old, outdated, internet tech, often shipped over with family and friends, sometimes government provided and sometimes left to its own devices, literally. Raise your hand if you've downloaded an anime illegally before. It's okay, I'll raise my hand, and half the rooms. You two, I much respect. If you've never downloaded anime illegally before, good on you. That's their really only option. There's no licensing agreements, there's no public access, there's no public libraries with free DVDs that we can check out, or little anime clubs at said libraries, per se. This is really kind of like what would happen if all of the legally, provided anime was just cut off. As it turns out, anime doesn't go away. It kind of just grows and populates. So this is a big deal going back to like early to mid 2000s, flash storage. All of a sudden, what we used to take multiple hard drives, now you can put it into a thumb drive, and bam, you've got 5 shows, 10 shows, 1,000 shows, episode upon episode, manga chapters. I mean, the list goes on. And as so long as you have someone with access to a screen and a USB port, whether it's USB 1 and they're happy to have that, absolutely you can get your hands on anime, or at the very least manga or pictures for your anime desktop backgrounds. So in 2007, Cuba made owning a PC in your home illegal, but let's be honest, kind of impossible to hide that many computers from that many people at any given time, and slowly but surely becomes just unenforceable. Now, cell phones left and right, flash drives are a normal thing, home networks between multiple houses, making almost small internets, or intranets as they're called, for everything like LAN gaming to simply file sharing, has only recently started to get cracked down, mainly with the protests that we'll talk about at the end of this presentation. So, slowly but surely, internet service has been offered over the last decade, publicly, of course, with cost, and especially with that inflation crisis making access to the internet difficult, but still available. And access to anime, obviously, is going to come with that. Raise your hand if you've ever gone onto a manga website and read your manga, possibly without paying for it. And a bunch of the same hands go up. You guys are just wonderful. I don't know how you're not doing that. If you've never downloaded or read manga illegally. Not saying you should, I'm just saying I'm impressed. So, how anime organizations start in a country with a despotic dictatorship is pretty similar to how it gets started in any other country. You get a bunch of young people, they all hang out together and they say, we should do more anime stuff. Bada bing, bada boom, you end up with your own anime club. That at that point needs to seek government approval, or at the very least, recognition that it is not counter-revolutionary. Now, for anybody that's ever run an anime club at a high school or at college before, you have to definitely get, maybe not inspected is the best word, but you certainly have to get vetted by your organization. They usually just don't do it with guns. So that was what they were able to do. We've got Nihon Bunko Grupo, which is theoretically the official anime club of Cuba. I'll get to the end of why there's some theoretical stuff. This presentation is really geopolitically sensitive right now, which is why normally I would tell people not to stream. That's fine. That's not okay. So, starting in the late 2000s, specifically 2009, starts as a Spanish subbing and dubbing group, essentially just trying to get enough equipment so they could provide any kind of access to translated anime and manga to the island that was not coming over in English to then be retranslated into Spanish. You can imagine how difficult it is translating things from English to Japanese, from Japanese to English, add another layer there, because let's be honest, getting Japanese downloads is not as easy as, let's say, getting English downloads. They're more likely coming over with a family friend, bringing a bag full of flash drives in their suitcase. The government lets it go, or there's possibly bribery, that's a different story. And of course, all of a sudden, whether it be your favorite TV shows. Granted, anime is, can anybody think of why anime in this case might be a little special? There's one really easy reason why anime is kind of special in this case. Go for it.
Because it's not from the U.S.
Bingo, 100%. That's exactly why. You pop open a person's flash drive, government agent pulls you over, pops open a flash drive on, government computer in the airport, looks on, sees a bunch of cartoons, says, looks like it's for kids. I hope your niece and nephew are gonna have fun. So, and of course, obviously you can imagine, did they check through all of the chapters of the anime or manga that they were reading for? Very unlikely not. So in this case, in the advent of the late noughts, I think we call them now, 2010 up till about the last 2 years, anime organization Nihon Bunko Gurpo, which is their official anime club, starts to host events in public parks. What started out as people meeting in their homes became, hey, there's space over there. Let's get our friends that want to sell anime stuff. And obviously you can start to see there's a little bit of, a little bit of free market capitalism, a little bit of self-expression. These little tenets of personal human freedoms that really do come with, as it turns out, most things that we kind of take for granted here, but we never think about fandom that way. If there's any time to point it out, fandom's a human right. Very simply put. The fact that these people are able to start doing the things that we do here, even though we're living in a completely different geopolitical situation, goes without saying, impressive. Just to give some nomenclature, without going off into full-on Spanish, usually the term otaku gets lumped in with another word very common in Cuba called freakies. Of course, it comes to the word freaks, or, freakies, if you want to be really English about it. This is pretty much like a coverall term for anybody that's kind of an alt, the alt scene, whether it's, into punk rock or, the arts. Of course, this is where, think about where you were in high school as a weeb. There's a very good chance you're hanging out with the art club kids, the drama kids, maybe the bowling team. And probably a bunch of punk rockers if you were lucky. And that's really what we get. It's kind of a subculture within a subculture. Within a situation of people unfortunately not having their basic human rights being respected. What's interesting is how things are done. Because now we know that, they have anime clubs, they meet in public parks. What are they selling to each other? Whatever they can get their hands on. You like Yu-Gi-Oh cards? Cool. Aunt and uncle have a printer. I'm gonna print out my entire deck. That's their Yu-Gi-Oh cards. Hey, we're able to get some art supplies from a non-profit that came and visited us from, Canada. We can make anime hats. We can start making cosplay. I brought a few artifacts I'll bring out towards the end just to show you guys some examples. But then you got a better question. Where are you going to buy this stuff? No free market capitalism. This is dictatorship. Where are you going to buy stuff? Well, that's where it gets really fun and interesting. I know the screen's not as big as I thought it would be, but no worries. If you take a look, you'll probably see a little bit of a walkway there and a Triforce insignia right on the ground. As it turns out, you want to find out where the closest anime store is. There's no public ownership or private ownership of shops. There's just usually government-owned restaurants or things like that, and bookstores. But people often start using their homes in this cases to run little stores. How do you know which home is selling the anime goods? They put something nerdy outside. The one I do not have pictured, and I wish I could, I just did not get a good quality photo of it, was a stained glass Paper Mario window. So imagine you're walking through a little Havana neighborhood, you're definitely trying to find the latest figure, quote unquote latest figure. Yes, it will be bootleg. If you hate bootlegs, I've got terrible news for you. Walking around, you see a Triforce on the ground, bingo, you just found, in this case, this one, what they called theirs Save Point, was their little shop. Which is great. You walk in, filled with figurines, paper cutouts, anything people can get their hands on, whether it's homemade or just genuine Chinese bootlegs. So, and of course that leads into cosplay. Now we're talking about, okay, secondhand clothing, secondhand wigs being the hardest thing to get their hands on. That's genuinely the hardest thing to get. But as far as spare fabric, not ending up in an industrial space or being used by the government, where you've got an old military uniform that you can cut up, maybe you've got some sewing equipment, it's handed down, you've got old, centuries old Singer sewing machines, just left over pre-revolution, and bam, you've got your cosplay halfway done. This is the part I definitely, if I was to ask everybody in the panel to watch now, this is the video of their anime convention 2 years ago, after about, obviously, almost 10 years of public parks and charging small little fees for activities. How they would do fees specifically, in fact, I'll go back just to click on a highlight how the vendors get involved. Vendor involvement in the conventions here in Cuba are much more intricate. If, let's say you want to go to the public event and it's at a public park, you can't charge for the public park. You can charge for a ticket to the event, but people can still walk around the event all they want. It's a public space. This is where the vendors come in. You buy a ticket, the vendors discount a huge amount of the cost on whatever they're selling. You don't want to? Cool, you pay full price, whatever those prices can be. And of course, they're inflated. The whole idea being is, well, if you're not willing to pay for the event and support these events from happening, you're going to pay full price. Or you can buy the ticket, they see your usually printed pass, and boom, you're paying a lot cheaper for your buttons and your bootleg anime figurines. Or if you want access to new episodes of anime and have either a laptop or a hard drive on you, they tend to always, as a staff prerequisite, have some kind of computer, desktop or laptop, whatever they can bring, so people can go back and forth, popping flash drives in, and getting the latest anime available, latest manga. Because at that point, if you can't afford an internet connection and go to the public park, which is does everybody remember 3G? 3G internet? I know it's a throwback, that's new for them. Yeah, 3G, they're now slowly getting 5G from China, but otherwise you can imagine, oh wow, I've got internet. This is too slow to get these 3 parts of the same episode on YouTube. But if you have a flash drive, you have a laptop or a desktop, you put that on display at these cons, and bam, you're going back and forth and back and forth. Just imagine a line of people, of 100 people, just so they can upload stuff onto a flash drive. That is exactly how this anime is able to spread so fast, without stable internet, or large internet infrastructure, or network infrastructure, as well as government surveillance. It's like, hey, government's watching our internet. They're not watching my flash drive. And of course, loads it up with anime and manga. So, next part's really my favorite part of the whole presentation. I'll just let it speak for itself. This was December 26th, 2018. And this was their very first time finally affording, after years of charging tickets, years of public parks, years of being at the zoo, years of being at the aquarium, any public space they could get. And this was the year they finally got into the hotel, the Panorama in Havana. I want to emphasize the room you were about to see is roughly the same size as the one we're in now. The hallway, probably about as maybe a little bit thinner. You'll see it in a sec. I just want to emphasize that because this is a decade of work for these people, and they only just now are starting to have conventions the way we see them at a hotel. That being said, I don't want you guys thinking that just because their anime convention was at a zoo does not mean it's not an anime convention. Still cosplayers, still vendors, just obviously you can imagine not having AC is a nightmare, and it is not a very well kept zoo. Specifically in Havana.
It's modern research. Your daddy's side. I know, your daddy's side, man.
So as you can see, there was obviously no fire code regulation. Roughly about couple hundred people. I just want to emphasize that we're thinking like, okay, maybe by our standards that might not be a huge, it's not, it's not super common. I'd like to emphasize that this is also on a weekday, day after Christmas. They have their anime conventions only on weekdays, they can't do weekends. The transportation infrastructure cannot, it shuts down on the weekends, not because of not getting used, it's the opposite. It's being used by everybody, and it's impossible to really get around the country very far. A lot of these kids that I spoke to came from, in some cases, well over 100 miles, staying with family, friends, you know, whether in or outside of the city, in the small little suburban areas, tenement houses kind of deal. And think about not having running water at your house, and you're focusing on getting to an anime convention, or having rolling blackouts on a regular basis, or knowing that your neighbor's spying on you, and you're still focusing on your cosplay. That's passion, if there ever was. And of course, it would be wrong not to highlight the cosplayers there and how they're making this possible. Reusing wigs, reusing fabric, reusing literally every aspect of a cosplay. Hey, finish that cosplay, use it for a year, great. It's gonna get cut up, used for the next piece. Imagine butchering your one cosplay in order to make another. Constantly, every single time. Not really having much equipment, much left over, with the biggest thing being wigs. Wigs for sure are the hardest thing to get. Not quite sure why. That's just literally every cosplayer I talked to, they were like, what's the hardest thing to get? Wigs. I asked them about craft foam and they were like, that's also incredibly hard to get, but wigs are the most noticeable thing. They'll sacrifice access to being able to build nice armor if they can get the right wig. They'll be like, we'll use cardboard for that, but you can't make a wig out of cardboard. And I'm like, I'm sure you guys have tried, so I'm not going to tell you maybe you could, because obviously that's been the instance. What's probably the most interesting about the cosplayers on the island is how many of them try to turn it into a living. Whether, for example, you see the Jack Sparrow right there, they ended up working at a local restaurant in Havana Viejo, which is like the older parts of Havana. Like we're going back, like Spanish colonial times, so kind of a pirate themed sort of restaurant kind of deal. And cosplayers do this all the time as far as trying to earn commissions. What's probably most interesting is that they have a union of cosplayers. Probably one thing I know that cosplayers in the United States, talk about, and certainly I've asked about, as far as like harassment of cosplayers and cosplay is not consent. I asked them while I was there, and they were like, because there's such unity amongst cosplayers, it's never really a big deal, which I thought was really surprising. But the big situation is that you just say something to the government once, and you're pretty much gone. So there's a very strong culture of fear. Within that culture of fear is, in this case, a weird case of safety for the cosplayers in a way that we might not ever think of, which is obviously not a very fun trade-off, but it is something that they talk to me about. So this ending has constantly had to change just because COVID was really a big case. Massive inflation crisis in Cuba hit really hard. COVID restrictions obviously hit things really hard. They didn't start getting vaccines until they developed their own about within the last 2 months. And to be quite frank, the protest movement that I'm sure everybody's about to ask me about. The circumstances within the last 2 months where Cubans started hitting the streets due to food shortages, restrictions on movement, restrictions on internet, restrictions on electricity, these things came to a head within the last few months, stoking artist protests that led to the Patria y Vida movement within Cuba, where many, including some of these anime fans who I, of course, have not included pictures of for obvious reasons, have started to rise up against their government to say, this isn't fair. I can't charge my phone, I can't watch my anime, and oh yeah, people are starving, just to add insult to injury. Obviously, one of those is a little bit more serious than the other. But I'd like you guys to take a moment and think to yourself, all of a sudden, you lost your freedoms, you lost your ability to feed your family, and the one escape you have to go to an anime convention or hang out with your friends or work on a cosplay has also been stripped from your fingers. That's what daily life is like for these people. I always like to ask a big question for anybody in the audience. What's one thing every anime fan wants to do? Every anime fan, no matter who they are, especially Americans, we love to talk about this. Once in our lifetimes, we would like to do what? Go to Japan. We save up for it. We get ready, we get the visa, bada bing, bada boom, we're a tourist in Japan, spending 2 weeks, kicking butt. The people you saw pictured will very unlikely ever have that option. Imagine growing up as an anime fan and knowing you will almost never, without risking life and limb, whether on a raft or hoping for the possible hopeless placement of a government position at an embassy in Japan, which, as you can imagine, we're talking about a country of millions of people. We're talking about maybe like 20 jobs. So if you work hard enough at learning Japanese, you might end up at a Cuban company that has Japanese business dealings. You know, obviously state-run and controlled. Doesn't mean you'll get to Japan. These guys, my time there, they had Japanese guests that came over, specifically at Kobayashi-san, who's a very famous cross-dressing schoolgirl, old man, fantastic guy. Their translator, I asked him, who was a Cuban government official, and I asked him, so, have you gotten a chance to go to Japan? He's like, I'm getting ready now. I was picked out of hundreds of possible people to go and do some translation work for a couple months. I was very impressed. There certainly is a few of them that we'll get to. Will the movement be restricted? At this point, it's been hard to get communication in and out of the country out of a few specific people these days, just because the protest movement, very sadly to say, as proud as it was to see, didn't end well. They're still fighting, they're still there, they're still existing, they're not going away. As mentioned early on, fandom's a human right, and that's really where we're at. I would like to say, for anybody that is going to Anime UI in a couple months, I definitely suggest that if you have any cosplay equipment that you don't have, we're talking about doing a charity drive to try to ship as much as we can over there. They haven't had their own anime conventions now due to the COVID crackdowns, as well as the protest movements for now about a year, give or take. And that's really where things stand. I know that this was not the most lighthearted of topics, but I thank you guys for coming. I'll open the floor for questions. Deadpool.
As far as your as the drive is concerned, is that just raw material? Like what exactly can you
Wigs, sweet Jesus, wigs.
Wigs?
I literally asked every cosplay. I've gone for 2 specific individual trips. One at the very end of 2018, I spent New Year's there, which was an experience. Apparently they like to burn effigies. That was fun.
Okay.
Not effigies of anything in particular. And walk around. If you've grown up here in Miami, all of the New Year's traditions, imagine that, but like times 10.
Oh.
It's like highly on steroids, I guess I would say, which was awesome. People walking around their neighborhoods, eating grapes and fucking moving luggage around, because apparently it's supposed to like signal travel, obviously leaving the country. And burning effigies in the street was probably the most interesting thing to see. So my second trip being August of 2019, and I did about 10 to 11 day stints each time, with the one caveat being that I would not stay in hotels. And my time with all of the cosplayers that I embedded with, between their convention director, the shop owners, and the cosplayers, I asked, what's the one thing that if you had to ask people to bring to Cuba for cosplayers, what would they say? And every single time, wigs, wigs, wigs. I asked them why, and they're like, they're impossible to get. You get one wig, that's your wig. If it's an Arda wig, wow, you're set for whatever you can turn into it. You just think about it. If it's going to be a long wig, keep it long as you can. If you're going to cut it, save the rest of the hair. Try to use it for something else. Make a weave. Literally trying to make it last. Everything else comes secondary, as it turns out. Any other questions?
It doesn't even surprise me.
No, it's not surprising.
Because I think about where I was in the con scene 10 years ago, when I was a kid, this one convinced me to do the sword walking contest.
That's actually the big thing I want to point out. My best experience in trying to describe this to people about what it was like going to anime conventions in Cuba is that imagine your first convention, and then imagine you did it 10 years before that. Like if you went to cons, your first con was 2004, imagine you went in 1994. If you were going to cons in 2013, imagine it's 2003. Go back in time with the computers, imagine it's old school ThinkPads, USB 1. If you had a projector, you were a millionaire. And that's really what I describe it. Probably the best thing is that they're certainly the sweetest cosplayers I've ever met. No offense to all of the cosplayers in here. I think it comes down with that culture of fear of like knowing that your government can take you at any given moment. Sweetest people. Sweetest absolute people.
I can't wait to meet them.
They can't wait to meet you. That's actually what this, I know at the beginning I mentioned it, and I definitely have to probably put it at the end. This panel is specifically dedicated to them. my first trip, I told them, what do you guys want out of this? Just for full disclosure, I'm not Cuban at all. Not at all. I'm just born and raised Miami, worked anime conventions for 15 years, and they reached out. They reached out of all things over Facebook, a large international anime convention group, and no one was interested in going. That's probably the most heartbreaking thing, is that most other otaku around the country don't go. So that's why I do these panels, because that's the one thing they asked. They said, we're just happy people know we exist. Because a lot of people before, even just a few Facebook posts, most people have no idea that these people are there. But I'm happy that you guys know that they are, and I hope we talk about them, because that's the big thing. Definitely come to Anime UI, we're going to try to do a charity drive, get as much stuff as we can. Oh, just throw it out there. Old laptops, computers, all that stuff, that goes great. I can't promise it won't be used for a protest movement. Granted, I can't promise it'll end well. But I will say that that's the big thing that they've also said is electronics, because that's how they reach their anime.
Can we bring episodes on USB sticks?
Yeah, that's how they do it. USB sticks, hard drives, all that stuff.
That makes sense, it's the same thing in North Korea.
Exactly. Yes, actually, that's a very good comparison. I do want to emphasize that Cuba's not the only country like this. Over the last 3-4 months, as things were going awry in Cuba, and luckily these people have not been cracked down on, they're not being viewed as counter-revolutionary, but they're not the only group of people in a country with a despotic dictatorship. Venezuela's got its own cons too. Just to throw it out there, if all of a sudden you were like, whoa, there's a lot more out there than we realized.
There's so many cons in the Caribbean.
Oh, yeah.
Not just Cuba. I want to go.
Jamaica's got a huge gaming convention. We're part of a whole region that we don't even think about. Everybody goes up north to Orlando. Imagine if you were, heading over to the DR.
Yeah.
They've got a huge Comic-Con in Dominican Republic.
Oh yeah.
That's pretty much concludes my panel. I'm definitely still open for questions, but go for it.
Okay, I wanna know, so you said, to bring, if we can donate electronics,
Yes.
obviously, the best 2-in-1 would be to load that up with a bunch of stuff in it, right?
Yep.
So what are some of the, if you know, what are some of the more popular, series or shows? It doesn't even have to be animated.
Shonen. When I started looking, and I'll be honest with you, I could spend the whole presentation just showing you pictures of their last decade of stuff. Raise your hand if you like Naruto. Guess what they like a lot of? A lot. It's very easy to do your first cosplay if it's a Naruto character, because all you need is enough cloth to make a head. And the pictures that I saw of the first 10 years of anime there was filled with Naruto fans of every shape and size. As far as popular, Attack on Titan was huge, just because anything that all of a sudden started to become much more available as far as the Chinese market for bootleg cosplay equipment or cosplay material. My first photos that I saw out of Cuba from a recent anime convention, this was 2017, and everybody was Attack on Titan jackets. Did they have all the straps and everything? No. But did they have the jackets? Yes. Did they all match? Absolutely not. Were they stoked? Ridiculously. But shonen tends to be I'll be honest with you, the other one, I'll get into a second. The other one, ironically, and this is just because it's a little bit riskier, but there was no end to the yaoi fanwars. Like I said, go back 10 years for anybody that's been doing this for longer than 10 years. And yeah, there's a lot in common with us.
Anyone have an old yaoi battle? Not to you!
No, I'm not saying, the funny thing is that that's, the number of buttons where it's just I heart yaoi that I saw, and that's a big thing, is the button scene. Have you ever seen a button press? Yeah, that can be a house band. As far as what kind of money you can be making. Obviously they can't buy their own houses, but I'm talking, for them, the amount of money that you can bring in. Best example, one vendor, just buttons. Gets a home printer, an old HB from probably 2009, getting printer paper as often as possible, and just printing out sheets, and then just button pressing, put them on an old bed sheet, hang them up on the wall at a con, and bam, you're a vendor. You're charging what I guess you could equivalent to $1 per, for our standards, we would say $1 per button. But if we were gonna go at cost, it's probably 2 cents for us. But for them, that's a lot of money. The most high average is $300 a month to live off of. So you can imagine, those buttons add up for them. Oh, go for it.
Just because I'm thinking about it, has anyone ever managed to get more blood over there?
yes, because when I asked about it, but the funny thing was, is I was just like, so what's the deal with like just craft foam and warbler? They're like, I mean, when it gets here, it gets used, but it's just doesn't come very often. Most of the way things get into Cuba is family members, and
Yeah.
remittances. That's the big thing is remittances. If you can ask, you know, Abuelo back in Miami, can you get this specific cosplay equipment?
No, that's how it was with my family too. Full disclosure, born and raised in Miami, I'm Dominican. And so much of what he's telling you about the regimes there, you know, it reminds me so much of my experiences as a child. And like, so it's like, whatever anybody who gets a thing down there, whatever anybody was like, hey, look, I'm flying to the DR. It's like, oh, meet it. It's like,
Give me your DVDs. Hey, your cousin wants your N64 because you don't play it anymore. And I will be honest, a lot of the old school video game systems that parents gave, you know, took away from their kids and said, I'm going to send it to your cousins in Cuba, they're still played.
Oh, do they need adapters?
For like HDMI?
For the outlets, do they need adapters or do they use the same?
You would think so. That's if you're staying in a hotel, yes. If you're staying in a Cuban home, no. That's probably the most interesting thing is the difference. And most people that travel to Cuba, at least in the last like 5 years, it's all been tourism. I told them my time there, I don't want any of that. No hotels, none of that. I want to live like that. And I did live like that. If you've never gone to a third world country and bathed with boiling, you know, hot water in a bucket and a cup, you haven't lived. But the outlet, I brought a converter. I didn't use it once because I found out all of it's European companies and, you know, like companies from abroad that do the hotels because you can't get American contractors. And, you know, countries that are allied with the U.S. don't really do much direct trading with them. There is lots of indirect trade. But if you're hiring, you know, trying to buy bulk amounts of like hotel outlets, a lot of it's coming from like countries like France. So of course you're going to get their outlets. Now if you're a home, first of all, you're probably using equipment that goes back to the 50s. American outlets, of course. And those outlets and things have been, you know, sent over by family members and maintained as such. I never had to use that converter. Every house I went to was on the regular, one of these, what are they, DC outlets, I think they're called? The AC/DCs, that's what they all have. I never had to use a converter. I was floored. I was just like, why did I even bring this? And they were like, we're not sure, too. You said you didn't want to stay in a hotel. None of us use those. I had another question, I swear.
Jeff.
Oh, go for it.
Well, you started on the video game thing, so like did you see do they have like game rooms there? Like do they like have old school game
Yes.
boys that they play with each other?
Yes, and yes. The most impressive being is that for their convention setups, because they could only rent one room at a time at the hotel per day, like a room like this, one day would be all vending. The next day it would be like cosplay presentation. Of course, another day would be just for gaming. I've been in a lot of game rooms, and I think we can all know that they don't smell very well. I will say that it was a furnace in the game room days. An absolute furnace. No one cared. Those kids, tank tops and all, they were playing their video games. The best example of how far they're willing to go to be able to like play video games, I was helping with some of their equipment because I went to volunteer. I told them, put me to work, helping do cons in Florida and around the country, please, put me to work. And they're like, cool, you're still our guest. Cool, help us with these video game systems and hook them up. So I grab a PS2. PS2's got a big chunk missing out, like a big cut open, like somebody had taken like a big razor and cut open, and its heatsink was exposed. And I'm like, first thing, I don't know if anybody remembers, PlayStation 2s used to have a thing called a top loader, where if you wanted to play import games, you would pop open the top, you'd switch the discs, and bam. So I'm thinking, oh, you did this for import games, I'm assuming? Except it's not over the disc side. She's like, no, what are you talking about? I'm like, well, if you wanted to play Japanese games, and they're like, I mean, we could, but that's like that so it doesn't overheat. It cut it open and soldered an extra heatsink because the PS2 was still overheated, so that he could still get people to play video games on, and they did. And that wasn't just because of the heat inside of that room. That was just genuine. The system had pretty much already, you know, fans broken. The big issue with getting electronic or just devices is that you have to send individual family members. You can't order in bulk there. Going to Amazon for them is like, you know, it's a fantasy. And they do. Should we go through Amazon wish lists like we were window shopping? And the end conversation was always heartbreaking. I wish they would deliver here, because they don't. Just imagine everything on Amazon and it's just like nothing will be delivered. You don't even want to go because you're just looking at everything you can't get your hands on. That's exactly what it was like.
Is it like bootleg games or like do they have?
Yes, there's bootlegs everywhere.
Yeah.
Bootlegs for.
Like, do they have any official games?
Yes, when they can get them, especially tournament-worthy games. The fight game seems really interesting. It's just don't expect fight sticks because you have to maintain it. Which is probably one of the more depressing things for fight game fans out there is that they would an arcade stick is the biggest luxury. Not just because you get the real experience of playing with it, but you have to maintain it. Button breaks, gotta replace it. So most things are controllers. They're controller based because with everybody having controllers, one person's controller breaks, hey, homie's got this working piece for yours, you got a broken piece for his, everybody makes one controller out of two. Constantly. So that's kind of but the games themselves, that was actually from the convention perspective of the gamers, they asked me to bring in specifically. As it turns out, games that are, it's the same thing with anime, with video games that are not, of course, Japanese, but there's also more European stuff. Assassin's Creed is huge out there. One of the games featured Cuba, and apparently the government was really happy with that. So Assassin's Creed gets a lot of passing. It's the weirdest thing I know, but apparently Assassin's Creed 4, they made Vault of Anna, and that was a big deal for everybody, government included. So the government was like, hey, not counter-revolutionary. Thanks, government. Not really. That too. The interesting thing about, like, outside of the anime stuff is the amount of stuff, like, the cars that I saw everywhere that were new, because everybody knows about the old 50s cars that are running on Soviet engines.
Yeah.
We're 30 years after the Soviet Union's fall. Those cars are getting old. So it's a lot of French stuff. Renaults and Peugeots, like as far as cars. I was really surprised because my first time riding a modern car was my second trip when we were going out to Otaku province out in the east of the western part of the island. And all of a sudden we had been riding in like old like Ladas from like the 70s. Which I will say, those cars are cool. They're really cool, like boxy Russian death machines. And I'm like thinking like, sweet, we're about to ride 200 miles to the other side of this island on old messed up roads in an old Soviet, beat up sedan. And here pulls up like a 2012 Peugeot. And by the way, they think like a French Toyota Corolla. It's not fancy. For them, they were like, we're gonna have AC, dude. And I'm like, oh shit, we are gonna have AC. This is gonna be great. Granted, that was for the ride to Oakley, and when we came back, of course, we were in a bus with no AC. But it was astoundingly beautiful. I'll never forget the road trip, because I wanted to go climb those mountains really badly, even though I'm never, possibly might never. Any other questions? Go for it.
So the government has realized I love Yahweh means boy love, because I know in Cuba they're against.
The LGBTQ situation in Cuba is strange. Very, 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 very strange. Not because of the community itself, but the government's treatment of the situation. In 2018, 2019, they were going to amend the Constitution of Cuba. The Communist Politburo essentially is going to remove a perceived restriction on marriage equality. And you're probably thinking like, oh, that sounds like some freedoms. Evangelical Christian organizations present on the island protested, and they didn't go through with the reform. That sentence is hard to say because it's so confusing. The most I can say is that as far as the scene being protected within the scene, it's kind of really what the situation is. The LGBTQ community, especially with all the Yahweh stuff, is absolutely as close to going back to fandom being a human right. That's the protection. They know that they're in a safe space with their friends. They can walk around and hold hands with each other. Which I will say, I asked about it. Just like, so what's the deal with government policy? It's like, government's not going to crack down unless they feel the need to. When they feel the need to, it can be at a drop of a hat. So that's scary. So to have two people of same sex holding hands in a public space being an anime convention there, that was a big deal. It was a very big deal. It's a sign of theoretical defiance. Theoretical. Knock on wood. But yeah, I know that's does that kind of answer the question? Just because it's really weird gray spaces as far as like what is and is not. It's very backwards at certain times. But yeah, you got another question? Anybody? Guys, thank you so much for coming. This was the big thing that they asked me to do out of everything. They did not want me contacting politicians because they're worried that if that happens, that was actually probably the biggest fear of theirs, is that if politicians from the states get involved, all of a sudden it's politicized and they all end up getting arrested. That's usually why I restrict from when I show pictures of this stuff, but it's just at the point where it's just like, they're doing it anyway. They're doing it anyway. But this panel's for them. That was the one thing they all said, please tell people we exist, because this sucks that people don't know we're a thing, except our family members. And then, let's be honest, our own community is very, except maybe down here in Miami and Fort Lauderdale, is very strong, like English. Like, everything's in English. So for Spanish fans to really get out there that haven't made the transition understanding English, it's a barrier. So just realize that barrier is there, and hey, kick it down. Because they are fans just like us. They treated me like family. Go for it.
Is it possible we can like take a group picture to send to me?
Sure.
Or you know?
Yeah. No, I'll be honest, I keep contact with them on a regular basis. I'm going to send them the picture and be like, they fucking left the panel. I'm sorry, I just realized I person. There's a child. Sorry about that.
Yes.
But yeah, we'll get a big group picture. They love that. Everybody down for a group picture? Let me put on my mask.
Sure.
Thank you guys for those who are not taking a group picture for coming. This, like I said, they just want people to know that they exist. All right, let's get a group picture. I have a mask.